Hello, Robson. Good to have you with us today. So this is Robson Dodd from Alumina, which is part of Youthscape, and you're here with your cat, Tootsie, who's we think's going to make routine appearances through the conversation today.
Probably, yeah. Hello, hi there. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. So you're here on Self-Injury Awareness Day, and we're going to have a chat about all things self-injury and and talk about that. So tell us a little bit about your like what you do, and why this is something that you end up thinking about quite a lot, same as we do.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, that is the big crossover for us, isn't it? That we're thinking about self-harm a lot and self-injury a lot. And
Mm.
so, yeah, I'm from Illumina, the Illumina project, which is www.selfharm.co.uk, which is part of Youthscape, but is a project aiming to try and help young people consider recovery from self-harm. So we work with young people from 10 to 17 years old, just going through a course of about 7 weeks of psychoeducation and peer support in an online space that is anonymous and kind of gives them a space to really answer questions about self-harm, but also think about the wider picture. I think commonly we get a lot of comments from young people saying that actually they're shocked by how little we talk about self-harm while we're in that space
Mm.
because we're thinking about their emotions and we're thinking about who they've got around them and their support network. And we're thinking about how they cope and what actually it means to try and cope as an adolescent in the world around us. And that's the main thing I do. That's where self-harm pops up a lot for me. And we are running those spaces kind of throughout the week online.
That's such an incredible resource. So let me just like drill down into what that looks like a bit just for anybody who's interested. So it's free, right?
It's free. It's free to access. Yeah.
It's a 10-week course,
6 or 7 week.
6 or 7 weeks.
Yeah, with a couple of week waiting list to kind of get there, where we'll send you some resources in the meantime as well.
Amazing. And then how it's accessed is that through it. So if a person was going to join, they would join on the chat function and nobody would be able to see their face or particularly know their identity if they didn't want to. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's online and confidential. So we host it on kind of an e-learning platform. So
Mm.
it's a bit of a step away from Zoom in that they can see and hear us, the people hosting the session, but they chat through a chat box and engage in the activities on the slides or in the chat box. And then just known by their first name to their peers in that space. So it gives them that bit of barrier and bit of protection just to engage in it in a safer way.
That's so great. And yeah, known about the Lumina's work for a while. We definitely flag it a lot. And I think there's some resources. Jenny's put some resources on our website as well that link to that. But it's probably the most accessible and available resource out there at the moment for teenagers who need that bit of support. So I'll make sure it's um, that the information comes up on the screen so that people can access that. But today is Self-Injury Awareness Day. Like, why do we need a Self-Injury Awareness Day, Robson? Like, what's that about? Like, why do we need it?
That is a great question. I think the most obvious answer to that and the most obvious way that that's a big thing is because we host the space in an anonymous space at Illumina, it just highlights that need for asking questions, that need to talk about self-harm, but actually a hesitancy in society and in people around us to talk about it. And that's why we have it as an anonymous space because it feels that bit safer. So when we think about, well, why do we need to make ourselves aware of it? I think part of it is because we struggle to speak about it sometimes, and it's a difficult topic to bring up sometimes.
Yeah, I really noticed that. I noticed that if I mention that we work with young people who so actually let me just flag up that we're using the terms self-injury and self-harm interchangeably. So technically, according to government guidelines, self-injury is the term for someone with a learning disability, self-harm is the term for someone without a learning disability, which in and of itself is, I mean, I'm going to say problematic, but I want to say discriminative. So we're just going to use both terms interchangeably, and essentially we mean anybody who's hurting themselves. So just to flag that up, and now I've lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, I was going to say about when we talk about the fact that, I often notice if I talk about the fact that we work with people who self-harm and self-injure, if somebody's had no experience or that's never touched their life, they are often uncomfortable. And if it has touched their life in some way, particularly if it's somebody that they care about, sometimes you can tell that they feel frightened about talking about it. So not in an overt way, but you almost feel a bit of anxiety creeping into the conversation, and almost like a bit of feels like, if we talk about this, like does it make it worse? If we talk about this, is it like it's going to make me feel anxious? It's going to freak me out a bit because I don't know what to do with this. And I think there's something so inherently out of control about the idea that somebody is hurting themselves, because we want to protect those that we love around us. And if somebody is hurting themselves, it feels like, how can you possibly protect that person, because they've become a risk to themselves? So it feels scary, and I think that makes us want to not talk about it. So what's the like, how do we push past that initial almost like instinct, like, I don't want to talk about this, and actually like safely talk about it? Like, why is it important to do that? What's that about?
I think that's a great question. I think one of the biggest things for me is realizing that it's a way that they're trying to cope. I think a lot of times it's a way that a person or a young person is trying to cope with, interact with, deal with the environment around them, or the situations they're facing, or the feelings they've got inside. And that actually, yes, it's harmful and yes, it's painful for them and for us to see the people we love hurting. But actually, it's a way that they're trying to get past that, and they're trying to get past something that is hurting them more, whether that's emotionally or whether that's the environment and how that's interacting with them. And so for me, that's one of the big reasons why it's good for us to speak about it, and why it's okay for us to become aware of those conversations. Does that make sense as a starting point for us?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really good. And I think, like, in order to talk about it, we have to become bigger than it, don't we? We have to be able to hold it as an idea in our minds and in our hearts, and not let it intimidate us. Um, and I think just that process of I think of two examples. One where we went to meet a young man who was really hurting himself in a really dangerous way, and the staff were so frightened. And one of the first things we said to him was, "We're here because you can't stop hurting yourself." And you could feel like, what are you doing in the staff? Like, you just named the elephant in the room, like that, like they were freaking out, but you could feel the relief coming off him. Like, thank you for just naming it. And that felt like the first breakthrough moment in building a trusting relationship with him. It was so interesting. But on the flip side, I remember somebody reaching out to me recently and saying, do you know any resources for a teenager I'm concerned is hurting themselves? And I sent them the website, which is of Alumina, www.selfharm.com. And you could feel their response was like, oh, I can't send them that because it's got the word self-harming. And I think they responded with something like, is this going to trigger them? And I was
Mhm.
like, no, the word doesn't trigger. Like, you're naming what is happening. You're not causing it to happen by naming it. And there's a real significant concern about just naming what's
Mhm.
happening, and about what that might do. But I think the reason why we have to keep talking about it, and keep talking about it in safe and contained ways, is actually the reality is um, that when we say it, when we say the word and we say it in a way that's not, we're not terrorized, it's okay, and we're big enough to think about this and hold it, then it pulls some of the intimidation off of it and some of the fear. And I think as well, like, makes a space for the possibility of recovery,
Mhm.
um, and for that this doesn't have to be everything that we need to know about a person, that there's other things going on.
Yeah, I think you've hit two really good points there. First is that there probably is something else going on. But because the self-harm raises the alarm bell, because it maybe is the fear word, it's the thing we're drawn to the most.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to deal with that. We're trying to figure that out when actually there's maybe something else going on behind it. There's maybe something else going on that is alarming that person, that's triggering emotions for that person.
Mm.
That if we can deal with that, the self-harm can naturally begin to reduce, or we can find an easier way to interact with the self-harm then. And the second thing was going back to that idea of it being like a fear. Like if we're acting on fear, we're probably not going to be responding with the best skills, are we? We're not going to be responding in the best way we can. There's so many young people who struggle because at some point in their recovery journey, they think that they need to kind of stop self-harm completely. And that's the big problem with relapse sometimes. It feels like they have failed because if they've stopped and then they've ended up harming again, like they have failed. And
Mm.
during Alumina, we try and remind them that actually recovery is a journey. It's something we're going to work through. And relapse might be part of that journey.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we failed. It doesn't mean that it's gone from we were doing well to we're doing terrible again. But actually, we've just changed the process a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's that fear of, well, if I'm harming, I'm doing bad, or from as someone else, if they're harming, then they're not okay.
Mm.
That maybe drives that conversation a bit, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really good. I loved what you said when we were just chatting before. You said, if somebody's hurting themselves, there's at least one other thing going on. And I think that's just a really beautiful rule of thumb. Like what the first question is what else is going on? Not like obsessing about the self-harm. It's a presentation of something else. And I think that's so helpful. So we were chatting before, and you know that like most of our work is with people, all of our work is with people with neurodiversity and the vast majority with people with severe learning disabilities. So those who, many of whom don't have any spoken communication. But that's probably more of a similarity than a difference because we were saying, if you're in this space and you're working with people who hurt themselves, inevitably you're working with people, some of whom will also not be speaking, and some of whom many of whom have neurodiversity. So, what's your experience of that, and why do you think that we see so many autistic people in this space?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think at Illumina we have found whether through chosen young people choosing to tell us a diagnosis up front, whether through conversation during the course where they've kind of talked about self-diagnoses or talked about diagnoses that's just come up in conversation, we found that autism pops up again and again, and other neurodivergence around it as well. And that, yeah, for some reason in the Illumina space, there is something attractive about that space to these young people for finding some support.
Mm.
And I think it's maybe because of the online aspect. I think it's maybe because of an anonymous kind of space. That different environment allows a different kind of communication engagement.
Mm.
But of course, that's just based on what they've said, based on what I'm thinking about why it's become such a safe space for them.
Mm.
But it definitely does seem to pop up again and again. And it's amazing to know that, like you say, that we're going to come across young people who are self-harming and who do have neurodivergence, because sadly the statistics are so high
Yeah,
in that area. But that actually there are things that they are seeking support and that they are finding that some of the support is useful,
yeah,
which I
yeah.
think is amazing and really hopeful for both our organizations, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So here's a sticky question that I often get asked, maybe not in a direct way, but in a roundabout way. Like if so many people with autism are hurting themselves, is the autism causing the self-harm? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, isn't it? I think my best response would be to say that there may be things going on in that person's life because they are living in a neurotypical world, or because they are part of a space that doesn't suit their needs, suit what they are. There may be things going on that will be emotionally distressing, that will be overwhelming, that will be will be needing to cope with. Um, from their autism, from what they are experiencing. But that doesn't mean that the self-harm is coming from the autism.
No.
In fact, it's probably coming from a lack of accommodation,
Yeah.
coming from a struggle with a sensation, with the world around them.
Yeah.
And I think the only one that maybe this is a question thrown back at you, the only one that maybe looks a bit different there is if it's an individual who's sensory seeking in some way.
Yeah.
Um, but even then, I don't think it's from the autism.
Me
I just think
neither.
it's a different one to the ideas I've thrown out already.
I agree. And there's such a like almost feels like, another pandemic of diagnoses, isn't it? Like we just want to diagnose everything. But I think it's not until you've been through the process that sometimes you realize that the diagnosis didn't change anything. The diagnosis just gave a name to something that maybe you were struggling to name before. So I think that no, I'm yet to see a diagnosis. Even there's some young people in our space that have syndromes that have really strong correlations with self-injury. But even so, I'm yet to see a diagnosis that causes self-injury, because if as soon as we say that, we're taking the person's agency away from them. We're saying that they didn't choose this, they don't have any control over
Mm.
this. And one of the things that, self-injury is an attempt to reassert some sense of control over often overwhelming emotions or overwhelming experiences. And so it's really debilitating. It's a really debilitating narrative, and it breeds hopelessness as well. Because if we ascribe a presentation to a lifelong condition, where do we go from there? I feel like it's a really unhelpful frame. But I absolutely agree with you. I think that we have to face that we're in a world that's been designed for able-bodied neurotypicals, and so anybody that's outside of that normative frame is going to find the world unsympathetic and difficult and to navigate, and that can feel very, very overwhelming. So I
Mm.
think one of the things that we both work with quite a bit in our different spaces is this relationship between self-harm and overwhelming emotion or overwhelming emotional dysregulation. So can you say a little bit about how you guys speak to that, and and the work that you do around emotional dysregulation, because it's such a big part of the story, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. We often say that at Alumina, we're trying to help young people start to do two things. First, we're trying to help them find different ways to cope, different ways to less destructive ways to look after themselves and
Yeah.
respond to that emotion. And second, we're trying to help them find ways to express, communicate, and begin to understand the emotion and what's going on behind the emotion, so that they can reach out for the help they need, maybe in other areas. So yeah, on the topic of emotional regulation, we're trying to help them begin to identify what the words are, begin to maybe identify how to communicate that to other people, and begin to express a little bit of what's going on inside. I often use like the analogy of when you put a Mentos into a Coke bottle and then try and get the lid on, and it's just building up with pressure, and it's got so much pressure in it. And that's kind of what's going on inside when we're not able to express the emotion in some way, when we're not able to get that out in some way. And
Mm.
sadly, and that's what self-harm might be doing for some people. It might be a way that we can help to get express some of that emotion, to get some of that feeling out. And so if we can find other ways to identify those feelings in the first place and begin to express them and communicate them, that's going to be a step towards regulating how we feel and being able to balance that a little bit more. And I think that word communication can be a really difficult one in this specific conversation. So I think it's as well really important to flag that communication can mean loads of different things. It isn't necessarily verbally telling someone. It may be as simple as identifying it for ourselves on a feelings wheel and using tools and resources like that. It may be that we communicate with someone via different means. I talk to young people all the time who don't want to talk about their emotions in person, but are more than happy to text a family member and think about writing a text to a family member about that. So it's important for us to as well realize that that communication can be really flexible, and we should find ways to make that work for an individual, shouldn't we?
I love that. That's so helpful. And thinking about how we communicate about our emotions, that it doesn't have to be sitting down and having a deep and meaningful with someone. There's loads of different ways of doing it. And I think that experience of having a strong emotional experience and not having the name for it,
Mm.
most of us, I think, had something like that happen to us in the pandemic. When we went into lockdown, we had both individual and collective experiences of feeling like this is horrible and I don't know what to call it. Like all of these new experiences of isolation and loss and fear and angst and existential crisis, all like pouring into us, and we didn't have any names for it. It was just like, oh, what's this? And I remember reading a bunch of articles about like people trying to find a word for it. Like I think our collective experience is called this. And it was really interesting. It was almost like a collective experience of alexithymia, we'd call it, wouldn't we? Like not being able to name the emotion you're feeling. And so I feel like that's a really nice access point for maybe what's happening for someone who has resorted to sometimes hurting themselves, this feeling of like something horrible is inside me and I don't even have a name for it. So I couldn't talk about it if I wanted to because I don't even know what to call it. And if I don't know what to call it, I can't even name it in my head. And so I'm going to replace that horrible feeling with a feeling that I am in control of. And that sense of like, often I think of it as like something inside me is unnameable, but I can bring it up onto the skin and there I can see it and I can name it. And I know it's bad and I know it's horrible, but at least I can see it and I can control it there. And so I think that journey, we were saying as well, weren't we? A lot of initial response is like, but we often have with our young people we support, and I'm sure you do with yours with the wider family members, is can you just make them stop? But
Mm.
actually, like you have to get underneath it to think about, well, where did it come from? And let's just start doing some wider work. And often that is around emotion. And I think about, a young man we were working with who was non-speaking. And so we just began really like, because whilst he wasn't at the time, we didn't think he was going to be able to name verbally what he was feeling. But we felt like, well, let's give it a go and see if he can respond to some suggestions. So we just began to work with what we could see and say, I wonder if you feel sad sometimes. And he was able to indicate, yes, I do. And then I remember saying to him, I don't think I'll ever forget it. I said, I wonder if you feel frustrated. And he went, oh, like
Mm.
this. And it felt like, okay, we're getting some words for some of the things um that are so difficult for you and that are overwhelming you. And the most extraordinary thing for him was that though he was broadly non-verbal, he began to talk about just the emotions. So he began to say phrases like, I feel angry, I feel sad. And he didn't want to say anything else, but he did want to talk about the feelings that he had, and that seemed to really bring a release to him. But there's this like yeah, there's this huge relationship, really, isn't there, between learning to name and hold and manage and regulate what we're feeling, as a way, maybe to begin to recover from self-harm and self-injury.
Absolutely. And I think that's an amazing example, because we might not know yet how to manage our feeling, but if we can say it out loud, like in that young man's experience, if we can say it out loud, then we, as the people working alongside or the people around them, can begin to help them manage that. We can
Yeah,
be the people who then say, well, what could we do to respond
yeah,
to that feeling, or how can we help that feeling feel a little easier to sit with right now?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the next step after the naming. But I think it's good to remember that some people aren't able to do that on their own right now. Some people maybe haven't learned how to do that on their own for certain emotions.
Mm,
And I think going back to the COVID example, and the lockdown example, many of us know that there's emotions in our lives that we didn't feel equipped for the first time we felt it.
yeah,
So we can even understand that relationship. I think grief and loss can often be one of the biggest feelings that if we've not experienced it, we don't know what to do with that feeling. And that's a really good reminder that it's not a different experience for someone with self-harm. It's no different to us and our experiences with emotions we've never handled before. There.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's been so helpful, Robson. I really appreciate getting to talk to you about that. Yeah, and I think it always surprises me again and again because the field that we're in is so separate from mainstream conceptions of self-harm. But when we get talking about it, there's no space between the way that we're thinking and working really. Um, so
And
yeah,
I was going to say, that I'm sure we've got a lot to learn from each other there because I'm sure we're bringing different approaches and different tactics and tools to the table because of the different fields. But actually, there's probably a lot of crossover there in what we are, in how we're resourcing and how we're trying to support people, isn't there?
yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Great. So we'll make sure that the Illumina resources are available for those that need to use them. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going, keep talking about it and demystifying and breaking off some of the intimidation and the fear that's associated with self-injury.
Absolutely. That sounds like an amazing goal to have. I think that's
Yeah,
a step from this show's Self-Harm Awareness Day, Self-Injury Awareness Day.
yeah. Amazing. Thanks, Robson.
Thank you
Appreciate
so
you coming
much.
on.
No problem. Thanks for having me. And it was great to join you for this conversation.